Good evening, everybody. I hope I am audible and you can see the slides. So first of all, I would definitely like to thank the Asia eHealth Information Network and Dr. Alvin specifically for inviting me and allowing me the opportunity to deliver this session, which focuses on certain aspects of a national level architecture initiative that I have been involved in personally right from its inception, about 2 years back. Obviously, given that we are in a situation where most of you or all of you have interest in the health domain, so I will also cover a few thoughts and inputs in terms of how we have applied architecture thinking within the health domain, and I'm sure that would be of specific interest to you. I would like to kind of highlight right at the beginning that all of the material and the content that I'm going to present today, I will of course make it available, to the secretariat so that they can be shared with you. And second is all of the content that you're going to see today is my own personal first-hand experience. So, and this is an ongoing activity that is currently happening and unfolding in India even as we speak. So some of the things are work in progress, but I'm sure the learning would be quite interesting given the size and complexity we deal with in India. So let me move forward with the slide deck. I think I was going through some of the previous sessions on this AeHIN hour, and I believe that most of you are definitely familiar with what architecture is, what enterprise architecture is, and I suppose some of you are probably even certified, TOGAF architects. So I thought I will start with a very basic foundational slide which talks about why architecture is important. So as you see here, and I'm sure you must have experienced in your respective countries and organizations that you work for, whether an organization has a formal architecture or not. When I say formal, I mean a formal architecture which is built or developed based on using some kind of specific methodology, example, the TOGAF ADM. Every enterprise already has an architecture. And this is important because the difference between an organization having an architecture by intent, by design, and by accident is that many times the so-called quote unquote accidental architecture may not be as efficient as a well-designed architecture. Nevertheless, the architecture is still there. And why is this important? Because if an organization or an enterprise wants to change its behavior, change its capability, change its business model, there are two things that determine its success. Number one is, of course, the culture, which is very important. And if you remember, Peter Drucker made a comment about almost 45 years back saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So culture is that important. And the number two is the architecture. Obviously, strategy is important, but provided the organization has the culture and the ambition to succeed, and of course, it has the architecture, the structure to make that successful. So this is basically the message from this slide. On your top right, you can see the difference between architecture and engineering. I think many of us make this mistake saying that when does architecture end and when does engineering begin? So I kind of put that picture right on right top just to give you a flavor of the difference between architecting and engineering. As I said, I will share the slides, but the basic takeaway from that picture is that architecture is about synthesizing, which means that ability to connect the dots so that you can see the whole, whereas engineering is about analysis so that you can build the whole, right? So you need the parts to be able to work together and using some kind of an engineering design. So this is the basic fundamental of architecture, and I'm sure it kind of resonates with your personal experience and knowledge. So with this background, I will go on to the evolution of architecture within India. So we call this India Enterprise Architecture. So in short, it is IndEA, as you can see there. The vision of IndEA is to establish best-in-class architecture governance processes and practices. to lead to optimal utilization of ICT infrastructure and applications to offer the experience of one government. So the basic philosophy of the IndEA Enterprise Architecture Framework is that a citizen should be able to go to a government agency, be it at the central level, federal level, be it at the state level or at the local level, and he or she should give a single government experience. He is going to a single government entity. He is not going to a department or a ministry. So that's the basic vision. Have we achieved that vision yet? That is something that I will share, but the vision as a long-term goal has been established. Now, the India Enterprise Architecture Framework consists of three parts. Number one, as you can see in the bottom, is the framework itself, which consists of 8 reference model that is based on TOGAF. I think all of you are aware of TOGAF, and the picture on your right top shows the the crop cycle, as we call it, which covers the various areas of architecture, all the way from strategy to implementation. Then there is a part two, which basically tells government agencies, be it at the central level, state level, or local level, in terms of how they should be using the part one to make their own architecture. So as you see, it is titled as an adoption guide. And finally, we have a part three, which is a recent addition. Basically, this infuses agile practices with architecture work so that it addresses one of the key requirements of government agencies, is that they don't have too much time to wait for a blueprint and then an implementation to derive the benefits of architecture. And I think this is the kind of I would say inquiry, or this is the kind of question that all of you may face when you go back to the senior leadership of an organization, government organization. They may say, yes, I do understand the value of architecture, but can we do something fast so that we can derive the benefits quicker? So therefore, we created a kind of an addition, an accompanying document, which is part three, which infuses agile practices within the architecture. So the whole idea is, can we balance the ability of agile practices with the rigor of architecture work? So these are the three parts, and all of these are based on the TOGAF ADM, which is already mentioned. Now, as I said here, the framework itself consists of 8 reference models. So these are the different domains of architecture. As you see, we have extended the domains. So if you're familiar with TOGAF, TOGAF basically talks about 4 domains. So we have extended domains because this was required by the stakeholders, so to speak. So these are the 8 domains of IndEA framework, starting right from performance, which talks about goals, measures, metrics, indicators, so on and so forth. Then we come to the business domain, which focuses more on the services. So the G2C, G2B, and G2G services, the capabilities and the business processes required to operationalize those services. Then there are 3 domains which are more, I would say, technically oriented or technologically oriented, where we have the data application and the infrastructure, the physical technology infrastructure. So that's what you see in the middle. On the left and the right of the picture, you see 2 important domains that touches every other domain of architecture. One is security. I think we all understand. And security is all the more important given that within the current crisis, for instance, now when you work from home, it's important that your workspace itself is secure. So I think I don't have to explain or belabor the importance of security. And then integration. Integration is important because it's all good to have, let's say, goals, good to have services, good to have data, but the question is, how do they work together? So that's where the integration domain of the architecture is capturing. The bottom of this picture talks about governance and management, which basically talks about what are the decision rights and accountabilities to ensure that the architecture is actually used or put to use to derive business benefits. Now, my intent here is not to go into the details, but I think you get the basic flavor. And what we do is, one of the first things that we did in the IndEA is to come up with certain key architecture principles. So you can see the same 8 domains as in the last slide, but these are some of the architecture principles that we have defined so that it is important and it is easy for us to to assess the compliance of architecture, let's say in a ministry or a state government or a local government or a city government, whatever it is, right? So for instance, some of the principles are use of open standards, ensuring that the architecture is technology agnostic or vendor agnostic, use of shared infrastructure, digital first, cloud first, services to be delivered on mobile. So there is a principle on mobile first, so on and so forth. So there are multiple principles which capture. These are the key ones that I have captured here. In the main document, there are about 36 principles, and each principle is elaborated. What does it mean at the government level, and what should they be doing to ensure that they comply to the principle? But I think you get the point in terms of what are the key things. So the reason why I'm showing you this slide is because it gives you the general contour of or the insight into our thinking when we develop the architecture framework for the whole of the country. Now, this is an addition or an extension to the earlier picture. So you saw the 8 domains. So many times I'm asked the question, what do the domains consist of? What do they comprise of? So here you can see a little bit of elaboration. So you can see in the performance domain, typically it consists of the vision, mission. It has policies, goals, objectives, indicators, targets, any regulations, any directives, any laws, anything. Yeah, that's captured in the top layer. Then you have in the business layer, it could be sectors. Sectors could be business sectors, any mission areas, your departments, your services, common services, shared services, service life cycle, so on and so forth. So, I don't intend to go through all of the details here, but I think it gives an idea. This slide gives an idea of the extent of rigor that is included in each of the domains, each of the 8 domains, covering all the way from performance to business to data to application to infrastructure to security, integration, and governance and management. So this is almost like it's almost like a chart that we use to understand whether our architecture is complete or not, and whatever architecture we design is complying to the principles which I showed you on the previous slide. So this is kind of in a nutshell what the enterprise architecture framework is at this point. So I'm just I hope it gives you a basic fundamental idea of what we have done. Of course, there's a lot more detail that need to be covered, and maybe that can be taken up in a different session. But I think I wanted to cover the summary of what the IndEA Enterprise Architecture Framework is all about. Now, what is important from our perspective is that many times when you hear architecture and when you're discussing architecture, you are actually discussing the solution or system architecture, which focuses on the technology aspect of architecture. This focuses on the hardware, the software that is to be used, the peoples and the roles they are playing, and other non-system aspects of the organizations, the processes, the rules, regulations, facilities, infrastructure. But what is important is that it is critical for organizations to define their enterprise architectures also, which you see on the left of the screen. So the reason I put this slide is to basically tell you that while both are important, there is a distinctiveness between enterprise architecture and solution architecture. And you see in the middle, I've put a boundary, but I've specifically mentioned that the boundary is permeable, which means there is a exchange of ideas. There is an exchange of inputs between enterprise architecture and solution architecture, so on and so forth. So what we have done is when we have designed the IndEA Enterprise Architecture Framework, which is based on TOGAF ADM, it takes care of both of these elements, so to speak, both the enterprise level architecture and the solution level architecture. Okay, so this is very important from our perspective, because we would like to show that the solution architectures are in alignment to the architecture of the enterprise. So let us see what approach we have taken. Now, obviously, just to kind of specially mention this verbally, that our architecture journey, that is India's architecture journey, is part of our Digital India initiative. And Digital India, it's a humongous initiative. And one of the questions that I typically get is, what is the role of architecture within the context of digital transformation that Digital India tries to bring? So this slide shows you the position of architecture right in the center, right in the middle of what digital transformation is all about. So you can see the different layers of digital transformation, starting all the way from the key stakeholders of transformation, which could be citizens, consumers, providers of services, governments, regulators, aggregators, investors. It doesn't matter, because it kind of goes beyond government, and it could include anybody in the economy. The second layer is what we call ease of living service attributes, because at the end of the day, we can have all the architecture and we can have all the digitalization that we talk about. At the end of the day, it is important that the citizen gets service which makes his or her life easy. And therefore, we have identified the 6 Ps. As you can see, there are 6 Ps there in the ease of living service attributes, starting all the way from services that are personalized, that are paperless. I think they are very self-explanatory. Then presence-less, which means that you don't have to see the or interact with a human being to consume the service. Proactive, perceptive, and pervasive. I will highlight what pervasive is, but I think what is important is that today, given the crisis, we have obviously this framework was developed before the COVID-19 crisis, but today when you see this, it makes a lot of sense, because in the context of the crisis we are facing, we would rather have services which fulfill all the 6 Ps. And that kind of becomes very, we anticipated that something like this could happen, and therefore it's important to create a digital society which fulfills, these 6 Ps of services. Then the third layer is, of course, the architecture domain. I'll just briefly introduce the 8 domains, so you can see the domains there. And then at the bottom layer, you can see the 3 key pillars of successful digital transformation. One is establishment of good institutions with strong governance, and there are certain elements of that. Second is understanding what the citizens and people want, so there are some elements of that. And third is having good delivery capabilities to ensure that you can deliver on the architecture goals and objectives. And on the side, you have the digital strategy and digital platform. I'll talk about a platform within the health context in a few slides later. Now, one thing that you may have seen in the principles, especially the business principles, is that we have aligned our architecture initiative or architecture program, so to speak, to the sustainable development goals. I'm sure you are familiar with this slide, so my intent here is not to elaborate on these 17 goals, but what is important is that, and I'm sure all of us understand, is that these goals do not exist in isolation. If you are familiar with the SDG, and health being one of the major goal focusing on SDG, there are 17 goals, there are 169 targets and 241 indicators. Of course, this picture is not complete, but it's a snapshot. It shows you how a goal in health could be related to a goal in well-being, or even a country getting investment, as an example. So this is a snapshot of how these goals, which exist in isolation in this view, actually are interrelated when you really go and understand. So it is very difficult for a country to achieve SDGs if they don't look at it holistically. And the reason I'm showing you this slide, which is, as I said, a snapshot of the 17 goals, is that we have used SDG as a basis for integration. When I say integration, it means integration at the level of goals, objectives, and KPIs, integration at the level of services, which is G2C, G2B, and G2G services, integration at the level of data, which I'll show you one slide later, integration to ensure that the applications interact with one another. So every level of integration is based on an integrated view to the SDGs, which is what I'm showing you on this slide. Now, I mentioned that integration based on data. So what we have done here, as you can see, is an example of how data-driven approach to integration has been achieved or is being currently achieved using SDG. So you can see the the lower layer is the data sources which exist in as disparate data sources, all the way moving up to the top layer, which shows how SDG is used. You can see the one of the pictures there is the interconnected picture to identify and ensure that the country is achieving its overall goals and objectives. So this is in a way how we are achieving integration using SDGs. So this is, as I said, the individual goals. This is the interconnected view of the goals, and this is how we are achieving integration at the data level. I don't intend to go into the details of this, but I think you get the point as to why integration is so important, and we have therefore highlighted that as a separate domain within our architecture. All right. So currently, the India enterprise architecture is being rolled out, and the nodal agency which has been tasked to roll out this countrywide is called the National E-Governance Division, which is within the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. So some of the major adoption activities that has been undertaken is to identify priority states, sectors, and public enterprises. Sectors are definitely health is a priority sector, education is a priority sector, agriculture is a priority sector, which are the usual suspects. There are certain states and union territories. So we in India, we have a total of 36 states and union territories. So it's impossible for us to do a national rollout in all the states for all of the other reasons. So there are certain priority states that have been identified to roll out enterprise architecture. Currently, there are massive sensitization workshops going on across the country. We are even rewarding good practices through a national conference. We have also undertaken capacity building, including higher degree courses, both at master's level and higher at the Indian Institute of Management and Indian Institute of Technology, where architecture and digital transformation is taught as a subject. There are national resources that have been created. So it could be access to a tool, access to templates, and many other things, RFP templates, RFP models, so on and so forth. So these are shared resources that have been created. And very importantly, it has been linked to a measurement framework, which I already talked about, which is the SDG. So currently what happens in states and union territories in India are ranked by their SDG goals. So, and therefore there is some kind of a healthy competition between the states and the union territories, states and territories to achieve their SDG goals. So in a nutshell, these are the kind of adoption activities that are currently going along. Of course, as you can understand, this is only a summary and many things are going on. And all of these things are being rolled out even as we speak. So this is an ongoing activity. Now, I think some of you who are familiar with TOGAF may have seen this picture, but I have added a few, few inputs on this. So this is in a summary what we have done. So TOGAF being the most, generic framework, which is completely technology agnostic, completely vendor agnostic, completely sector agnostic. So that becomes our foundation architecture. We have used the TOGAF to build the India Enterprise Architecture Framework. So that's the second level of specific. So India Enterprise Architecture Framework is specific to India, and it is specific to the government sector. We are moving from generic to specific architecture. One of the architectures that we have created is the National Digital Health Architecture, which I'm going to share a few slides later on. So that's an industry or sector specific architecture. So you can see we are moving a little bit more specific, and then we the digital health architecture to the facilities to build their own respective architectures. So you can see we have moved all the way from a very generic foundation architecture called TOGAF to a very organization specific architecture, which may be specific to a hospital or a pharmacy or a state or even a district or whatever it is, right? So this is the whole idea of architecture continuum. But all of each specific view of the architecture is aligned to the to the prior generic view, which is the takeaway from this slide. As I said, we have created a digital health architecture. So I'll share a few slides on that, give you some idea of how we have adopted that in the health domain. So this is the blueprint that we have currently created. It is called the National Digital Health Blueprint, NDHB, which is derived from the IndEA, which I just walked you through, which is further derived from TOGAF. So this is how it works. Now, I think all of you are definitely familiar with, how health informatics has evolved from in the last 50, 60 years. So in the National Digital Health Blueprint, we have definitely tried to move from e-health to digital health that you see, and the difference in terms of different characteristics. And now you will see why I was showing you the 6 Ps. For a country to achieve 6 Ps, it is basically adoption of digital technologies like analytics, AI, robotics, machine learning, IoT, all of that stuff, to provide services so that people live in digital society. So this is basically what we are targeting to achieve in the digital health space. Now, I think as far as my knowledge goes, the National Digital Health Blueprint that India has come up with is the first national level digital health blueprint in the world. No other country has done an entire digital health blueprint of this size and this level of complexity. So let me walk you through, the key highlights of the digital health architecture. So is derived from the overall vision. So now you can see we had the vision for entire architecture. Now this is the vision for the health, digital health. So it is to create a national digital health ecosystem that supports UHC, universal health coverage, in an efficient, accessible, inclusive, and effort and timely manner. So that the idea is to be able to use wide range of data, information, and infrastructure services, and use of open standards. Um, that is important. And the second important part of our vision is that the digital health blueprint ensures security, confidentiality, and privacy of health related personal information, which I'm sure all of you understand that these are the key showstoppers. So it's important for us to maintain privacy of the health information. And this vision statement was triggered by our Prime Minister, Narendra Modi. So if you see, this is actually a LinkedIn article. You can actually still go and read the full article. I've just given a snapshot here, where the Prime Minister talks about the need to provide solutions and move away from silos. So you can still Google and read this whole article. It will give you some insights into why the vision statement was crafted in the way it is, right? So my intent here is not to read you through the full article, but I think you get the point. So the whole philosophy and the whole thinking behind developing the digital health architecture is to move from silos to integrated solutions, and with the specific mention of the health sector. So the National Digital Health Blueprint consists of these key sections, if you will. It does have a vision and principles. So I've shown you the vision in the previous slide. And of course, there are principles which are derived from the IndEA principles, which I've shown you earlier. The second part of the document is the elaboration of a federated architecture. I will explain that. Third is use of standards and regulations that are relevant in the health domain. Fourth is identifying priority services. So that's a section, priority services in the health domain, of course. And fifth is what is the institutional structure required to make all of this work. So these are the 5 key sections, if you will, of the National Digital Health Blueprint. Okay. Now, given that we are discussing architecture here, I will focus on the architecture part of it. And of course, if there is interest, I can take the other layers of it in different sessions, but focusing on the architecture. Now, we have to understand one thing, why federation is so important in India is because in India, the governance level in, basically at the minimum exists at 3 levels. Sometimes it could be 4 levels. So there is a national government, then we have government at the sub-national level, which could be at the state level, district level, and then we have governance at the facility level. When I say facility, a facility could be a hospital, which could be a primary healthcare center, which could also be a super specialty hospital. So that's identified as a facility. One of the the first question that comes up is, does it mean that are we going to centralize everything? And our answer is no, because the intent here is not to centralize, but to find alignment between the 3 layers of governance, which is why the federated architecture is so important. So for that, we have identified certain principles. As you can see there, all digital health data and applications will be held at 3 levels. National, state, and facility level in a decentralized manner. So that is defined as a principle because it is constitutionally required. Our states have a lot of autonomy, even though there is a central government. Second is patient data is held closest to the point of care, so which is important, and typically it is the facility. Third is citizens should be in full control of the health data. So everything that is done with the citizens' consent. Fourth is, if you want to, if let's say a national level facility wants to access a state level facility, it will only be through links. There will not be a creation of or a repetition of the same data at the national level, because then the state level or the facility level organizations think that they are losing autonomy and control of their data. So these are the kind of principles that we have defined to bring in the federation concept within the architecture. So that's very important, and I thought I'll highlight that and why we have done it. So this slide shows you how we have achieved federation. So this is an elaboration from the principles which I showed you in the previous slide. This slide shows you the elaboration of federation that we have tried to achieve within the digital health architecture. So you can see on top how citizens access the health services. It could be through apps, health portals, health locker, And then our value-added services. So these are value-added services which are provided by small and medium enterprises who may provide value-added health services. Typically, most of the information will continue to be residing in at the local level, which could be at the city level, urban level, or facility level. So you can see some building blocks there. Some of that will be, consolidated at the state level, which is a collection of local bodies, and some of that information will be held at the national level. Of course, for instance, if we want to deal with a public health emergency like we are facing now, we do need some data at the national level, some information at the national level, so that you would all understand, so that there are policy interventions that can be taken at the national level. So this is how we have ensured federation in the architecture within the digital health blueprint that we have defined, which is derived from the IndEA enterprise architecture framework, which I introduced to you a few slides back. And some foundations, so you can imagine that when we are using a federated approach, governance is very, very important. So we have identified certain governance mechanisms. Number one is federated architecture operates collaboratively, so which means it calls for collaboration between central, state, and local facilities, because in India, health is a state subject. Second is states and facilities have the flexibility to pursue autonomous strategies. So we don't say that simply because there is a central directive, it doesn't mean all the states have to exactly use the same approach to, to solve the problem at hand that they have. So they have some level of autonomy, and which is important. However, what is important is that given that we are looking at a common federation, it is therefore governed by the concept of a common goal. And the goal is, of course, defined by SDGs that I have shared with you earlier. There is an administrative role, which is the institution and, the institution and governance. So if you go back a couple of slides, right on top, you have this layer called institutional structure, right? So that's where that is the entity, so to speak, which provides the administrative role to manage the federation. States and facilities can participate in a federation selectively. So basically they can choose what they want to share and what they do not want to share for reasons which I will not go into. That itself is a huge discussion point, but that is definitely built into the governance model. Resource owners retain ultimate control of their resources, which means in most cases the resource owners are the facilities that exist at the local level. And however, all of the members of the federation, so to speak, in this case the states and union territories and the facilities, will conform to the overall laws and regulations. So these are some of the governance mechanisms that we have defined to ensure that the federated architecture works and we are able to derive benefit of it. Now, within the digital health blueprint, we have identified certain building blocks. Now, my intent here is not to go into the details of the building block, but I think the fundamental definition of a building block is these are common capabilities that are reusable across multiple use cases. So we have created multiple building blocks, okay? So right from digital identity, some of you may have heard of Aadhaar, so that's a digital identity. Registries, so in this case, in the health, the registries could be registry of doctors, registry of other health professionals, registry of facilities, so on and so forth. So these are the building blocks that we have created, and these are called the core building blocks, and the second level is the solution building blocks. But what is important is that how do these building blocks work to realize a use case? So this is the slide which shows you how the building block is used to realize the use case. So I've taken all the way from SDG, which I started. So you can see here right on top, given that we are in a health domain, so the sector I've taken is health sector. Within that, I've taken SDG 3, which says good health and well-being. And I've taken the SDG target. So, United Nations SDG, if you're familiar with that, already defines the targets. Okay. Now, from there, once the target is defined, remember one of of the National Digital Health Blueprint is services. So one of the high impact services to achieve that target, as an example, is a G2C service, that is care services for mother and child spanning prenatal and postnatal period. So that's the kind of service that is provided. Now the next, the two steps there, that is the use case steps and the key activities, are basically an elaboration of that service. So it's a use case steps. But what is important for you to take note of is the layer at the bottom, which talks about the different building blocks that are used, that are required to realize this use case. So you can see all the way from the sector at the highest level to the use of building blocks to realize the use case. So you can see a complete traceability all the way from the sector to the building blocks that are required to build the use case. So this is an example of how the National Digital Health Blueprint works. Okay, so all of this is coming from the building blocks that I have showed you earlier, but I just wanted to give you one example for you to understand. Okay, um, as I said, I think all of you do understand. So within the context of India, if we want to provide services which are spanning health domain, it requires multiple ministries to be involved. Definitely the Ministry of Health, and I'm sure that is the case in other countries also. It definitely requires Ministry of Chemical and Fertilizer, Ministry of Women and Child Development, and a few other ministries that need to work together. And therefore, what we do is in the digital health blueprint, we have therefore identified the key priorities and built, as you can see here, system model. So this is an example of a system model. So the question that comes up is, how do we identify services which are high priority? So this is how we do it. So this is an example of a high priority item that has been identified in the blueprint. This, as you would understand, is management of long-term conditions or chronic disease management. So this is an example of the system model that we use, and this is the kind of interconnectedness that we want to capture, right? So again, I think you get the point in terms of why it is important for us to remove the silos so that we can provide better services. And this is an example of how we do it. Um, my intent here is not to go into the details of this, but nevertheless, I will highlight on the processes that we use or the approach that we use to create a system model like this, which is actually documented, in the framework itself. So we identify strategic priorities. So management of long-term condition as an example is a strategic priority. We create a nodal loop, we elaborate the priority, we find the key variables, look for the causal linkages, so on and so forth. And finally, the whole idea is to identify services that are required and build the use cases for the services. And the use case is the way it is built is, which I showed you earlier. This is the kind of use case elaboration that we do. So I think you get the picture in terms of maintaining traceability all the way from a blueprint to the architecture, to federation, to identify of the priorities, to the services, and how the use case is realized, using building blocks. Okay, so I hope it gives you an idea. So let's see where we are at this point. I think we all understand that doing architecture and getting a country as large and complex as India, it is not easy. And I'm sure even in your respective countries and agencies, you go through a journey. So typically, this is the journey that we go through. Sometimes we have to sensitize the key decision makers, so that they understand what they're doing at this point will not work, and therefore something needs to change. Obviously, there are, so these key stakeholders need to internalize what they are going to go through. They have to start supporting it, and then we have to start doing some proof of concepts and pilots. Of course, the target that we are trying to achieve is boxed out in the dotted line, which is basically adopting of architecture at scale and ensuring that architecture is done in such a way that it is embedded within the practices and behaviors of the organization, where you can say that the architecture is institutionalized. Now, have we reached there? Not yet, because again, our maturity, differs from state to state, differs from territory to territory. But in general, if you ask me, at an average level, we are between experiment and adopt. Institutionalization is something that we hope to achieve within the next 3 to 5 years, given the size that we are talking about. But we are between experiment and adopt, because certain states are still experimenting with this, and certain states are completely convinced, and let's go ahead and do something with architecture. And that's why we are basically going through all of the rollout activities which I just described a few moments earlier. Now, how does the institutionalization take place? This shows you how the institutionalization takes place. So this picture is one slide which is very important, because it shows you how architecture to be institutionalized. On the left, we have seen the development cycle that is all the way from SDGs to use of building blocks, but on the right, it needs to be integrated to the budget cycle. This is something that we are at this point working on and making the states and territories to understand, is that they can use architecture to plan their budget, to prepare their budget, to allocate the budget to different initiatives and programs they want, and to control their budget. So this is the kind of journey that the organization needs to take place, be it at the national level, be it at the state level, to ensure that you achieve that highest level of adoption, which is institutionalization. This is what embedded architecture is. When organizations start linking their architecture journey, which is on the left of this slide, to the budget cycle, then you can say that they have achieved a level of institutionalization where they will not even realize that they are doing architecture, but they are deriving benefits of the architecture. Okay. All right, so that was my last slide in terms of how the adoption of architecture progresses, and these are the, for further reading, these are the 5 documents. Would strongly recommend. All of these are available. You can Google and find them. They are not. They are available, freely available. So number 1 is the practitioners. No, I've not given the TOGAF document itself because I'm sure some of are already familiar with the TOGAF standard, but I've given the specific practice guides that are important from your perspective. So first one is a practitioner approach of developing enterprise architecture using TOGAF ADM. Second is starting an enterprise architecture capability in government sector, which is a 2019 publication. Third is a more elaborate, description of IndEA. So you can see number 3 there, which is implementing IndEA. It's a practice brief for senior government leaders, which is a 2019 publication. Then the fourth one is digital transformation and the role of enterprise architecture, published by ITU in 2019. And the fifth one is the SDG Digital Investment Framework, the whole of government approach to investing in digital technologies to achieve the SDGs. So this is published jointly by the International Telecommunication Union and the Digital Impact Alliance, DIAL. And these are the 5 documents that I strongly recommend you can have a look at that and understand how organizations are using or countries are using enterprise architecture to achieve SDGs and to achieve goals and targets to derive the benefits of architecture. With that, I will close my session. I am accessible, that's my email, but I'll be happy to take any questions or any queries or any comments at this moment.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Pallab. So we have several questions already. The first one is, how are architectures best started? Through a national government agency, top to bottom, or from stakeholders or implementers from ground up?
Good question. And this is something that I always face. Now, what happens is, if you have a very complex entity, for instance, you're looking at a national level architecture, even in India, for instance, before we came up with the framework, which I shared with you, there was already a state that was doing architecture. And typically, this is what happens when you have a country of multiple states and local entities, there will be definitely 1 or 2 states or 1 or 2 ministries who are more progressive. They are not going to wait for the national level framework to come. They will say, let's go ahead and do something. So typically it starts bottom up, but at some point you have to decide that the bottom up kind of approach is not scalable, because the states may not be interacting with one another for various reasons, and we all understand those reasons. So therefore, that was the approach we took. We knew that there was a state already doing this even before we developed the national enterprise architecture framework. And then it became a top down. So initially it becomes bottom up, and then you need to make it top down to ensure that everybody aligns and everybody is consistent with the overall framework that the national level architecture defines.
Thank you, Dr. Pallab. The next question is, what key lessons can you share from the India EA experience?
There are many things, if you really ask me, whenever I go to a ministry or a state, the questions and the key lessons that we are talking about is, for instance, how do you ensure that you get support from the senior leadership, both from the political leadership and the executive leadership of the government. It is not easy to convince people about the benefit of architecture. The second is, how do you show benefit quickly so that there is sustained interest? So that's another learning point. So that's important. Third is, it is important to choose the right agency or right organization to ensure that the success is there, because every organization doesn't provide the equal amount of support. So for you, you need to be very careful as to where you kind of show the success to generate more interest within the architecture thinking. Uh, the other learning point is, should it always be the information technology department or function who should be driving this? Because in many cases, you would understand, for us to come up with the target architecture, there may be regulatory changes required. So therefore, sometimes the IT department or the IT ministry or function does not have the authority to make regulatory changes. So these are some of the on ground learning points that we have to navigate even as we roll out the architecture.
Thank you, Dr. Pallab. We have a question from Sir Jai Ganesh. Sir Jai, would you like to ask your question about the NDHB?
Thank you, Shah. I think Dr. Pallab has already answered about the NDHP blueprint, as well as the second question related to the state EA. Just a part of it is, I'm still need clarity, Dr. Saha. This is regarding, like, because I live in the southern states, both Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh, which already had the EA way back in 2014, if I remember right. So then came this IndEA. So how does it now coexist, or how does it means, how did it change? Because that is something that I'm still in the dark. Thank you.
No, yeah. So it didn't change, as you rightly said, and I didn't name the state, but yeah, that is true. So the state of Andhra Pradesh was actually the first state that had an architecture, a statewide architecture, before the national framework was developed. So it didn't change. So what the benefit we had was, when we were developing the national framework and the digital health framework, the learnings from the state and different ministries of health at the state level were included in the overall framework. So it was not as if we were doing a theoretical exercise saying that, yeah, this is what TOGAF says and let's develop a framework and we don't even know whether it will work. So all of the practical learning points which were covered and which were discovered within the journey of Andhra Pradesh and a few other agencies that had already done architecture before the national framework was developed, was built into the framework. And that's why it became a very practically oriented, very pragmatic guide. So that's how it is. Now, has it helped in the adoption, future adoption? Absolutely, because whenever we talk about the national framework, we also say that this includes the learning points from the states that preceded the national framework.
Thank you, Dr. Saha. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Pallab and Sir Jai. The next question is from Dr. Tanvir. So what led to the establishment of the India EA? What motivated the Indian government and its agencies to establish an architectural governance, processes and practices, etc.?
The motivation is, as you would, suspect, given a large country, we have been doing we have been doing e-governance for multiple years, almost 30, 35 years, 40 years. Ministries and states have been doing their own stuff, and I'm sure you're probably aware of that. The key motivation for us to be able to build this national framework is, number one, the benefit that the state of Andhra Pradesh had derived. Again, we realized that because it was a state level, initiative, the benefits derived were limited to the state. But if we were to do a national level architecture, I'm sure the country will derive a lot more benefit, because as you would understand, architecture is something that is done for things that are big. And the benefit is, when you're big, you really need to be architecting something like that. Other than that, the motivation was, of course, looking for interoperability. I wouldn't use the word elimination, but minimization of silos that exist across the ministries, replication of efforts that are going on. So you go to the states and territories, everybody starts to build for instance, a data center when it could well be a national data center where each state can have its own space. So on and so forth. So it's basically, benefit derivation at a larger scale. That was the first motivation. Second was interoperability. Third was minimization of silos. These are the key motivations that drove the Ministry of Electronics and IT to build this national level framework. But we realized that the benefit of the national level framework will only be, accruing once we roll out the architecture, and that is the current journey at this point. So therefore, having a blueprint or having a framework is great, but the benefit of a blueprint of a framework or a framework is only when it is rolled out across the ministries and across the states. And therefore, as I said, I had identified earlier, we have identified certain priority sectors, certain priority states, and we are rolling out the architecture across the country.
Thank you, Dr. Pallab. Our next question is, was a government-wide convening initiated with participants from various agencies such as the government, the private sectors, and NGOs, or was each state approached separately?
No, it included development of a steering committee and a working group, which included multiple ministries, representations from multiple ministries, states, because as I said, for instance, health in India is a state subject, so it's important that certain states are involved. So all the states and local governments were involved, right, all the way through the cycle, development cycle, review cycle, everything else. So it was done. It was not done in a way where there was a team which sat in the corner and then the magic happened. It was not like that. It was always a lot of involvement of the states and different stakeholders who can play a critical role in the success of the rollout, and therefore they were always involved in the development and rollout of the architecture.
Thank you. The next question is, what matrices were applied to identify which states would be prioritized in this project? Is there a resource library available to the public containing templates used?
So what happens is, even within the country, as you would understand, all the states and territories are not equal. When I say equal, it is equal in terms of the development, equal in terms of the technology maturity. We have not used a formal model, so to speak, to say, let's do an assessment and then say which are the top 5 states. We have not done that. But in general, there are certain states who are more ready and willing, and we have gone with them. Because see, this is another thing which is important from a governance perspective. We did not want to force architecture in the beginning. We wanted to look for states and agencies based on certain priorities, because they kind of directly cover the services that are important to the citizens and the people of the country. And number two is whether they are when they are more willing and ready to adopt enterprise architecture. So in all the cases that I mentioned, for instance, Andhra Pradesh and a few other states, uh, the support, so to speak, the active support came right from the top level, which is the chief minister of the state said, let's go and do it, and I'm going to support this. So that is very important for us, and that is another learning point for us, where you really want to create a critical mass of willing and ready states and territories before you really do an entire national rollout.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. So our next question is, what would be your advice to countries as to how they have their own national EA?
When I say I don't know whether I've understood this question properly, but how to have national EA, I would say it depends on the size of the country. If you think you are a kind of a middle-sized country and you could still find one agency or a ministry who are more willing to take this up for various reasons, it could be, as we understand, I think all of us do agree that in general, agriculture, education, health are priorities for any government. So if you think these are the 3 priority sectors, maybe you can do a sectoral architecture before you do a national level architecture. And the reason is what I have already described earlier. If you find success at the sector level, it becomes much easier for you to justify a national level architecture. Okay, so this is one way to do it. So it is, as I said earlier, it is a little bit of a bottom up initially, but then followed by a top down approach.
Thank you, Doctor. This question is about resources. So what kind of resources are needed by a country to have an EA?
Oh, resources can be definitely human resources, but see, from my own experience, what I have seen is the biggest area where countries need to build their capacity is to have trained architects within their ranks, within the government staff, so to speak. In many cases, what happens is that these major architecture initiatives are given out to external organizations where the country and their agencies have very little control of what is being done. They have very little visibility. So I would definitely recommend that the countries definitely build their own internal capacity to at least oversee what an external entity is doing, so that your architecture outcome and quality is much better. Otherwise, it is not easy to manage a program like an architecture. Okay, that's one. Second important part is to establish a program office, because architecture, if you see, when you start, it may be small, but as you scale it up, it can consist of a multitude of a portfolio of projects and initiatives. And as you would understand, these projects and initiatives are interlinked. So there are certain things to be done before certain other things to be done. So let me give you an example. When I talked about digital services, one of the things we have in our remote states is that whether that state even has a connectivity, right? And sometimes those are part of the prerequisites that need to be put in place. And therefore, program management is extremely important. So these are the two things that I think are important from a from a critical resourcing perspective. Number one is internal capacity to oversee architecture program. And number two, a very strong program management office at the national level.
Thank you, Dr. Pallab. We have already reached the time, but maybe we can have one more question as the last question, Doctor.
Sure.
What
Please.
challenges have you encountered, and are you still encountering them while implementing your framework?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is always a ongoing activity where challenges are definitely part of the equation. So many times I get questions where it may not even be relevant, relevant to what architecture is doing, but even aspects like, first one is, see, please understand one thing, right? Irrespective of which country or which agency you come from, chances are that there are already certain ongoing programs, right? So the first question you will get is, what happens? You guys are coming and talking about architecture. What happens to our existing programs? Are you telling me that we have to discontinue all of the stuff that we have done? So that is the first challenge that you will face, to convince that no, it doesn't mean that simply because you're doing a national level architecture, you have to therefore undo everything that you may have done in the past 30-40 years. The second challenge is, which department or which function or which ministry should lead this initiative. In many cases, in many countries, it is the Ministry of Electronics or Ministry of Information Technology. I have been in places, especially in certain states, where the planning department drives it because it is the most influential department. And I always recommend that you find a department which is able to push through the changes that are required, be it the Prime Minister's office or the President's office or the planning department or the finance department or whoever it is, or the Ministry of Information Technology, but they should have the clout to get these things done. So these are some of the major challenges that we always face. The third one is, how can we show quick results? You cannot come to a state government or a facility, let's say even a hospital, and say, what, we are going to do architecture and leave us alone for the next 3 years and then we will see what happens. They are not going to buy that, because things are very dynamic. So you have to show quick results, or at least show some quick wins, so that your interest is sustaining across across entities. The fourth challenge which I always face is that what happens, how do you sustain interest in architecture across election cycles? I don't know whether we can do much about it, but yeah, there are many countries who face elections and they say, how do we ensure that there is continuity of interest even though there is a change in government? So these are some of the major challenges. There are no clear answers to these, but these are the questions that you will face. The challenges are never technical, never about the architecture steps, never about the technology, never about the tools or notations or the framework that you use. These are all about governance, all about management, all about managing the program.
All right, thank you, Dr. Pallab. So before we close our session, I would like to call on Dr. Bunchai and Dr. Alvin.
I'll go first. Dr. Palab, thank you very much for your talk. It's very, very informative. I regret that we won't be able to have our general meeting this July in Vietnam, but we hope to have something virtually like this, where we can strengthen the capability of the ministries of health and the ministries of ICT of the AeHIN countries on enterprise architecture. And I hope that you won't tire helping us out at AeHIN on building enterprise architecture capability in governments. So thank you very much, and I look forward to working with you more in our EA work, Dr. Palab. Thank you. Dr. Bunchai?
Thank you, Dr. Pallab. I don't have anything to add more, but Thank you very much for your contribution to the network. Our network also have frameworks, and we put the one of our framework is the architectures. We are striving to help all the country to have similar to the Indian are now working on. Thank you very much, and we hope that you can still helping our networks to get more information and also learning from the open group and also from India. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll be happy
very
to
much.
with the community. Thank you very much. Have a good
Thank
day.
you. Good night, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Pallab. Take care. Be safe, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.